In one sense, this is one of the most fundamental sessions because it's a kind of the big overview of where we want to go. Now, I know that we're talking about authority and imposing something. All I can say is that when I started teaching church revitalization, I knew nothing about it. As I told you, I was appointed to a church in Paris that needed it. I'd never heard the word revitalization. I didn't know what it meant at all, never heard it. So I said to the people, well, we're going to replant this church because I was a church planter. So we did that. And suddenly I found on internet, they were talking about a thing called revitalization in the States and organizing conferences and so on. So I went on and found all sorts of things. And there are some interesting books. And if you join up for the year-round mentoring that I run with Danielle, we'll read 2 or 3 of them together. But when I started thinking about it, I used to say the first step in the implementation, or one of the first steps, was to think out and develop a vision for your church. And I've changed that. And I now say, this is the vision we're going to work for. So I'm kind of imposing on you. But this is something we built up together over the last few years. Okay, you can change it around and so on. But I really think this is a fundamental way of looking at a healthy church in Europe for the coming days. So as I said, all the way through this week, we're going to be talking about a vision and a process. I just wanted to give a little bit of extra information on data. It's not the most important thing, but it has its importance. So when I started looking at revitalization, I looked at all the websites, and this was a study done by the Southern Baptists in the United States, but I've also found it on websites of other groups like the Assemblies of God and so on, accepting that in America as a whole, only 10 to 15% of churches were really healthy and multiplying, 70 to 75% were plateauing or declining, and 10 to 15% at or near risk of disappearing because they got small. We hear all the success stories in the States, Scott's Church and so on, but I'm sure there are loads of small towns in the Midwest and so on where the churches are really declining and plateauing. I don't know. I don't know the States well enough, but everyone seemed to agree that this was a correct figure. So I said, what's happening in Europe? So the country I knew the best was France. So I have been for several years the chair of the Evangelism Commission of what we call the CNEF, with the National Council of French Evangelicals. So I was in a good position to contact all the different 22 denominations affiliated to the CNEF. And I did a very intuitive, subjective study. It has no claim to be scientific. But I said to them, from this thing we saw there, where intuitively would you place your churches in your denomination? As healthy and multiplying, plateauing or declining, at or near risk of disappearing. Now you have to know that there's been tremendous growth of the number of churches and Christians in France over the last 60 years. And this afternoon I'm doing a workshop on that. If you want to come to it, the second session this afternoon. And we've moved from about 50,000 evangelicals in 1950 to about 750,000 today. There's been tremendous growth in France over those years. So I was saying, do we have the same problem of church revitalization as in a more traditionally Protestant country like the States, for example? And the results when they came out were this, that they intuitively, the leaders of these denominations said 51% of the churches, okay, healthy and multiplying, but 38% plateauing or declining, and 11% at or near risk of disappearing. And a lot of these in the 11% were the more rural churches, because people were moving into the urban areas, as Stefan was saying earlier on. So even in France, it's 50-50, or 51-49 to be accurate. It's 50-50 that we need church planting and church revitalization. And on my desk in my study, I have this picture. It's an animal called the Tasmanian tiger. It became extinct in 1936. It wasn't actually a tiger, but it had stripes. So they called it the Tasmanian tiger. And this was in the zoo in Hobart in Tasmania. This was the last one. It died in 1936. Of course, there are people who think they've seen them since. There are always people looking for things like that. And I put this on my desk to saying, we must not let this happen to our churches. It's just a little visual reminder. The Tasmanian tiger became extinct. We don't want our churches to become extinct. So I think it's also interesting to have some little ideas of what are signs of decline. There are many things we could say about these, but these are the main things that I've discovered in my experience and by reading books and talking to people. The signs of the decline. Number one, we no longer dare to invite people to our church from the outside because they think they won't understand. They won't feel at home. So we don't even dare to invite people to come to the churches. That's the number one sign. The second is a numerical decrease, and going with it, the increase of the average age of the congregation. Now, the numerical decrease might not be totally visible immediately. It can happen little by little. You don't realize it's happening unless you maybe look at a photo of the church from a few years before, or if you do like I do, I keep statistics. Every meeting I've had over the last 40 years, I've made a list at home afterwards of the people who were there. And like that, I can more easily know if someone is not coming anymore. I can detect patterns. Okay, sometimes as the church got bigger, that was more difficult. But even so, I tried to do that. I didn't tell the church members. I just did it. So there can be a numerical decrease. The third thing is that the structure and activities of the church become more important than life in Christ. In other words, routine can set in. There's an English expression, we say going through the motions, which is very difficult to translate into other countries. I have no idea how I'd say that in French. You're going through the motions, that is, you're doing things because you've always done them. And so keeping the things going, the management of the church becomes more important than the true life of the Spirit in the church. The fourth thing, and I found this in various European countries, that family dynasties rule the church. I remember talking to an eldership group in a church in Paris, which was planted in the 1960s. And we were talking with them and they said, oh, we can't change anything. We have to remain faithful to our founder. Wow. But sometimes this can be a family, 2 or 3 families who have planted the church, and they want to keep their hands on things. They don't want things to change. And so then the focus is on maintaining what was there rather than change in any shape or form. These are big subjects and we could talk about them for a long time, but I just wanted to give you some of the signs of decline. Then there is a culture of taboos and resistance to change. Living in the past, a kind of nostalgia. Stefan was talking about that, saying how you like the hymns from the past, or you like the way things were done. Although I would actually add that it's not always the fault of the older people. I've found some young people who've grown up in the church don't want any change either from what they've grown up in. It's not just the older generation. And I've actually found in church revitalization that some of the older generations are happier to change because they so want to see the gospel being preached and people being reached that they are prepared to change. But that's a little thing we could talk about. So there is a kind of nostalgia sometimes. I've heard the expression, a museum church. You go into it and it's a bit like going to a sort of museum of a church from 1900 or something. And then the Great Commission, or even the gospel itself, can be forgotten. When I say it can be forgotten, there are 2 reasons for that. The first is as such, as we mentioned just now. When the church is founded, people are really keen to reach out to others. But little by little, it's the services provided, the youth group, the women's group, the children's groups and everything, which become more important to organize than continuing to reach out. And then even the gospel can become secondary. And although I have no particular wish to go back to any particular era of the types of songs we sing, yet I think it's very important to even think of the words. I was at a national conference 2 weeks ago in Paris, and I wrote to the organizers and said, do you realize that on Sunday morning we sang 7 songs and the first 6 a Jew or a Muslim could have sung them? Because it's all about God is great, God knows everything, we can trust God. A genuine Muslim or Jew could have sung the same. They weren't singing heresy. There was nothing wrong in it. Sometimes they were based on the Psalms, but Jesus was never mentioned until the 7th song. So you have to be very careful on this. Jesus wasn't mentioned, the cross wasn't mentioned, the resurrection wasn't mentioned until the last song of the day. And these are little things. Listen to people's prayers. What are they asking for? Are they really based on seeking people's salvation? I remember in another church going to a prayer meeting, and someone said, well, it's our special Christmas service on Sunday. And I said, well, shouldn't we be praying that to invite people and communicate the gospel? And they was just surprised. No, this is for us. this is our Christmas special, if you like. So we have to be careful that not only the Great Commission is forgotten, but even the gospel itself. It becomes, the first generation is terribly convinced of the gospel. The next generation, it's in the church statutes, the confession of faith. You have to sign to become a member, but you don't talk about it so much. And then the next generation doesn't even realize that it's so important. So there's some of the signs of decline. So if you like, there are 2 needs for revitalization which go together. The first is the visible one, which is the numerical decline. But behind it is the more important one, that we're not connecting with non-Christians when we preach the gospel, which is why I call my book Reconnect Your Church. We're not connecting with the society that we're in. And a lot of the even theological disputes we have sometimes disputes from the past. And I think that the vision that we're suggesting is a way forward that can bring together people from slightly different theological points of view, because that's less important than where we're going to reach out to people and be connected to society today. But just briefly, first of all, a few words about numerical decline before we talk about the vision. I think this bell curve is very, very typical of human life. Tomorrow, if you like, I think when Nathan talks about the biblical basis, we see this bell curve over and over in the history of Israel. A good king, it gets better, and then suddenly it goes downhill again. So often a church, it's planted, it grows and grows, and at some point it reaches some kind of stability, a kind of plateau. But nothing is less stable than stability. Wow, think of that. When it gets stable, it's not going to stay stable that long. And so a decline can set in for all sorts of reasons, and we begin to go down, and it can reach a point of extinction or death, if you like. So what is revitalization? When do we need revitalization? I would say the first place we need it is here. Even while the church is still maybe growing, we have to keep thinking all the time, are we doing the right things in today's culture? So it's going to be here. Though most people begin to realize it's necessary when we get on the downward curve of the bell curve. And some churches don't start reacting till they get to there. And that's why Jonathan has got a job in FIEC for the smaller churches. So revitalization has lots of different aspects to it. And one of them is that it can happen at all sorts of stages in the life of the church and should in fact be a continuing process. As soon as it's revitalized, you have to start the next stage of revitalization because society is changing. And you take any company manufacturing anything, the same bell curve is there. If they're selling loads and loads of stuff and sales begin to drop off because people don't need it anymore, then they've got to change something. I don't know what example I could give, but one of them is we all knew when we first had computers we had a mouse. Or perhaps some of you didn't. Perhaps you weren't that generation. I don't know. Had a mouse, but who buys mice today? You don't do it very often. Not so much. So a company making these things had to make something else. It's all the time adapting to a new situation so that you don't go into decline. And this is what's been happening in Europe over the last, I don't know how many years, but at least 50, 60, maybe 100 years. That there's been this decline of churches because we haven't been connecting with society. So that's the numerical side. The other one, we heard about this a little bit in the last session, so I won't stress this, but the need to connect with non-Christians with his basic expression of Paul, I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. Now, it's not the process. He doesn't say, I become all things to all men, so they all become Christians. He actually only says that by all means I might save some. There's no guarantee. God alone will call people to him. But our responsibility is to be all things to all men. We can't force people to become Christians, but we can give them the opportunity by being at least communicating in a way they understand. And so there are three different cases we can talk about. There is the one in Pisidian Antioch where Paul was talking to the Jews in the synagogue and used the scriptures to show that Jesus is the Messiah. Some of the expressions he used in Acts 13 would not have been at all comprehensible to someone outside the Jewish faith. For example, when he says, the fact that God raised him from the dead is stated in these words, I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. Wow, I don't think we would say that was clear. But for the Jews at the time, they had identified verses which were messianic. So they understood that in their context. But if I go out into the street in Visla or in Paris and say, hey, I got good news. God is going to give us the holy and sure blessings promised to David. I'm not sure that many people would really understand what I'm saying. The next place where Paul went, which is in Acts 14, was in Lystra. Now, this is a more rural place, and he spoke to the inhabitants about the Creator God. And this time, he didn't actually even mention the scriptures at all. There's one allusion to a scriptural verse, but he says, for example, you must not worship idols because God has not left himself without testimony. He has shown you kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season, providing you with plenty of food and filling your hearts with joy. Now, I grew up in an era where often evangelism started by saying, you're unhappy, you need the gospel. And Paul's saying, you're joyful, where does this joy come from? It's a very different approach, actually. I've been surprised in this one. God gives you joy, he gives you food, he gives you crops and rain to make the crops grow. That was he was communicating to a rural community who were idolatrous and didn't know anything about the scriptures. And then when he gets to Athens, there it's a very different case because he starts using very abstract language, abstract vocabulary. He quotes their own poets. He doesn't even quote the scriptures. He quotes their own poets. He uses words like, in him we live and move and have our being. Now, I don't know what the peasants in Lystra would have thought of that. They say, don't know what he's talking about, this guy. In him we live and move and have our being. All I care about is my crops growing. So it's a very, very different world that he was speaking to. But in each case, he, in one sense, called to repentance. Even in Athens, he says, now God commands all people everywhere to repent. That is, to change the way they think, literally. That's the word in Greek, to change the way you think. So he's calling people to repentance. So, that is the introduction. What is a healthy church for today's Europe? And this is what I suggest. It's that picture. My only disappointment in the book, Reconnect Your Church, was that they couldn't put that colour picture inside it. But if you want it, you can get it very easily on the website that our network has set up, which is called, very easily, Revitalisation, with an S, because we're in Europe, revitalisation.fr. It's set up in France, but it's bilingual. You click on the right flag and you get it in English or French. And you will get that picture which you can download. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this diagram and say, this is, I think, the kind of church that we need to be working for. And this is what we're going to be working towards all week. Firstly, on the left, you have this blue oval in which I define a healthy church extremely simply. So simply that even a theologian can understand. The gospel is at the center. We are gospel people. A gospel at the center. We are redeemed through the gospel. And a church is where Christians learn to love God and to love others. Because this is what Jesus said were the two greatest commandments. You can't have anything more important than what Jesus said were the two greatest commandments. To love God and to love others. And to do this in our cultural context. Again, I think this is very scriptural. We've seen some examples of it in the previous slide. But I'll give you another example. In Corinth, Paul wrote 3 or 4 chapters about food sacrificed to idols. It was a very big question. Now, when the church was born in Jerusalem, it wasn't a question. Because I don't think there are many pagan temples in Jerusalem at the time. It wasn't a problem for them. But little by little, as the gospel spread out from Jerusalem, all around the Mediterranean, they came into contact with all sorts of other cultures, all sorts of other beliefs, and they had to help the Christians to work out, how do we face these other beliefs? So in a place like Corinth, where all the social life took place at meals in the temple, what were they supposed to do? And the argument is very subtle. It's not straightforward at all. It's about 3 chapters where he's going around this subject. And you can actually take this as a paradigm for almost any other question which we're dealing with in society today, the way he argues it out. Or let me give you another example. One of my daughters was a missionary in Madagascar for 10 years. And like a lot of countries in Asia, there is a lot of ancestor worship. So when a person becomes a Christian, how do they deal with that? How can you, as a Christian, should you take part in ceremonies for your ancestors? What should you do? How can you deal with it? Now, honestly, in 40 years in France, I've never had to deal with that question. It's not a European question. On the other hand, in my church, I've had to teach several times already, even in a small church plant, about how we face up to woke culture. Because if we don't know how to do that, then we're not connecting with society and helping people to connect with society. So we have to, a healthy church is simply the gospel at the center, where Christians learn to love God and to love others. That's the first part of a healthy church. The second thing is that the healthy church will be perceived and lived out as both the gathered church and the scattered church. This is a theological concept which has always existed, which is becoming more and more important, I think, as the days go by. And I'll try to explain why. The gathered church are all the organized events for Christians within a church. So, just to make it clear, because COVID has come, pandemics have come, if you are on a church Zoom meeting, you are the gathered church. It's not the scattered church. That's not what we're talking about. This is the organized event where Christians are brought together, gathered together as Christians in the church. And so they organize all sorts of events. One of them being, obviously, in most churches, the main Sunday service. Although I think in a revitalized church, we may need to think in terms of having more than one service to reach out to different types of people within the society, which is very diverse today. We may come back to that later in the week. And then all sorts of other activities for edification and training. And I'll be talking about this on the later on during the week. But edification is to motivate us as we learn to love God and train us to help understand the people around us so that we reach out to them better. I've been very struck in the last few months by some verses in Hebrews chapter 10. It's probably the only verse in the whole New Testament that says that we must meet together. Hebrews 10 verse 25. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. We must gather together as a gathered church. But why? Verse 24, 25. To encourage one another and spur one another on towards love and good deeds. In other words, we're meeting together to learn how to live as Christians in the scattered church. And to be honest, I don't think we spend more than about 3% of our time as the gathered church. Even if you go to all the meetings, 97% of the time, you're out in the world, if you like. And that is why the scattered church, the emphasis is no longer on organized events, but initiatives made by Christians with the people around them. And what are these initiatives in this square box? Doing good and sharing the gospel in the 4 relational networks that most people have. In other words, family in the wider sense, the community where you live, your neighbors, maybe you might get involved in local politics or the people you meet in the street. Third, your place of work, or if you're younger, your place of education. And fourth, what you do in your leisure time and with your friends. These are the networks we have. And this is where we are being sent out to. So to use an expression, a word which is used more and more, this is the evangelism through the missional church. Because missional means you're being sent. It's not a word which is in most dictionaries. If you look up the word missional on Google, you get practically sent only to Christian websites. It's not for me, a real word, but we can use it. We know what it means. Well, it was used because missionary was thought of as being sent to the far side of the earth or something. Missional, you are being sent. And I remember a brother in our church once, he was leading the worship, and we had our backs to the exit door. And I don't know how he did. I think he got someone from his family. He put a great big poster on the door so that at the end of the service, we saw this, and it said, "Attention," be careful. You are now going out into your mission field. and that was really, really helpful to hear that. So the mission of the church is taking place, and I'll explain a bit later why, through Christians in contact with people in these 4 relational networks. Now, traditionally, the church in recent years has tried to be attractional. Now, I've known 3 stages of church life since my conversion when I was in university. I was converted at the back end of a type of church, which can still exist, which is very formal. you wore a tie and a jacket and a suit, and the women wore dresses or hats, and you didn't talk in the sanctuary, and you had the organ playing and so on. And so evangelism was by going out to do door-to-door work, or with Billy Graham in a stadium or something, or you hired a neutral hall, as he said, you didn't invite people to the church. And then from the end of the 1960s through the 1970s, we moved into what is our evangelical typical church today, with soft Californian music and very casual and so on, casual dress. The difficulty to start a service is to stop the people from talking so that we can start, for example. It's a very different feel that we have today. And the aim of it is by having the kind of music, going back to music, that they think that people will want to come and hear in a church, or the kind of approach that they so that the aim was to be attractional. The only problem is it doesn't attract anyone, or very few. The only people who would come are generally only the people who have become friends or be contacted by the Christians in this missional church in their 4 relational networks. They will go with them to the church. When I started a church plant 18 months ago, we put 20,000 flyers in people's letterboxes. I've got a company to do it for me, because in Paris, you can't even get past the doors, the letterbox, unless you've got the right badge or something to get in. 20,000, 3 ounces. One man who didn't like it that I quoted the French philosopher Blaise Pascal on the fire, because if he's Catholic, you shouldn't be using it. Another woman who came and said, well, I prefer Hillsong. Well, we're only about 6 of us in the meeting, so the comparison wasn't very difficult to make. And a third guy who came, and he's been with us ever since, and has become a very committed member of the church. So in today's world, that's not how people come. They're not going to come. They've got plenty of other things to do on a Sunday and so on. So this is what I consider to be the pattern of a healthy church in Europe today. Now, how it's going to work out will depend on all sorts of factors. There's no one way. But this vision, I think, is important. And what I like about it, today people call it not a diagram, but an infographic. Sounds better. You call it an infographic. You give this to people in the church, and they say, yeah, that sounds good. They're not yet on the defensive, because they don't see all the implications of it. So I like to give it out to people from the start and say, this is where I think we need to be going. So to put it, let me put this in a different way, based on what is in the blue part. I just say again, a healthy church is a group of redeemed Christians who are learning to love God, to love people in their cultural context. In other words, revitalization is reconnecting your church. In other words, what we have to work on are 3 things at the same time. And this is what we'll be looking at all this week. Working on the spiritual dimension of revitalization, that is loving God. Working on the social dimension of revitalization, how we love people. And working on the societal dimension of revitalization, that is the cultural context. Okay, I'm a preacher, so I had to find 3 things beginning with the same letter S. But it's the spiritual, social, and societal that we have to work on at the same time. And often in the past, and I don't want to correct our sister talking revival, but revival was very often seen only in the first level, on the spiritual level. It was a revival of the individual's piety, which is a very good thing, but did not necessarily lead to an increase in the social dimension, or being in some way in phase with society. And you see this because when you see certain revivals from the past, they haven't always lasted. When I was a student in Bristol many years ago, there was an old lady in our church who came from Wales, and she lived through the Welsh revival. And she loved to invite the students to come and drink a cup of tea with her. And she'd talk about this Welsh revival and everything she'd been through and everything. Today, I think Jonathan will probably agree, South Wales is one of the hardest parts of the United Kingdom to preach the gospel. So it's very strange that where the revival was is the hardest now. So I think we have to be living these things out, the spiritual, social, and societal dimensions at the same time in the gathered church and the scattered church. So the implementation of this, the process, if you like, is what we're going to be going through this week. And very rapidly, I'd just like to say a few words about this, because we're going to go deeper into it later. The spiritual aspect, as I've mentioned just now, is meeting together to encourage each other to love and good works, to love God, to love others, Hebrews 10, which happens through worship, motivating us as we think of who God is and what he's done, doing for us, through Bible teaching, and through instruction on how to be good witnesses in today's world. And I'll be talking about that later in the week. Then the social aspect, improving relationships within the church and with unbelievers. The gathered church is where we learn to love our fellow believers, and they can be very different from us. A good place to learn how to have good relationships. And the scattered church is where we go into these 4 relational networks. And to love people in a very genuine way, show an interest in them, listen to them, do good to them, encourage them. Because you may be the only Christian they know. So you are the ambassador, if you like. The social aspect, as leading the Evangelism Commission for the National Council of Evangelicals in France, we organize a professional survey, using a professional survey to find out I would have liked to ask the question, how would you like to be evangelized? But you can't really do that in a sort of professional survey. So they asked the question, how would you like to learn about a religion? And the answer that came more than anything else was, although it's not written here, people prefer to have a relationship with someone of that religion. Although the number one thing was internet. Obviously, 35% wanted to find out via internet, and 18 to 24-year-olds, 45%. But the next thing was talking over a coffee with someone of that religion. You have a relationship with the person, you go for a coffee or a drink or whatever. 23%, so that's a quarter of the population. Or the younger people, 37%, which also shows the importance of hospitality, inviting people to your home, non-Christians, your neighbors, just getting to know them. Because there's so much prejudice against Christianity. That's the problem. Greg Pritchard, the director of ELF, often says that evangelism in Europe is like introducing a man to his ex-wife and saying, she would be a good wife for you. Because people thought they've rejected Christianity and they don't need it anymore. So we're saying, no, think about it. Well, why should I? I've rejected it. Another thing about this social aspect, we organized another survey only 2 years ago among people converted from a totally non-evangelical background. 89 people altogether I managed to find from different denominations in France, and asked them what were the human factors, not the spiritual, the human factors that led to your conversion. And the vast majority said a relationship with a Christian in their circle of friends and acquaintances. And very similar, feeling welcomed and accepted by them, but also being supported and listened to, free to ask questions. So building a relationship with a person. What is interesting is that among these 89 people, not a single one mentioned music. And when I started an evening service reaching out to young professionals in Paris, we decided to stop having music. We sang just once a month. We called it our vintage service when we had music. The rest of the time we didn't, because the people who were not Christians were a bit embarrassed. Should they stand up and sing with us? sing the things they didn't really believe yet, or what. They had no problem when we read the Bible or when we prayed or anything. So we went in that way. And I was very surprised that what my 17-year-old grandson said to me only last week. He doesn't go to church so much. I said, why not? He said, well, all they do is sing. I want to learn things. Very interesting. 17-year-old said that. So that's the social aspect. Societal, facing today's culture. There are three cultural contexts: the local, the national, the European. Locally, it's going to look very different. The kind of things I would do in Paris, I wouldn't do if I was in a village church somewhere in the middle of France. The local is important. National, you cannot avoid the weight of your national history for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of things. In France, most people, when they hear the word religion, put the word war with it, wars of religion. There's a whole history of wars of religion. Religion divides people. Religion causes violence. That's the background, if you like. And then the European is all our post-modern way of thinking, which we could go into. So I think that we have to understand this for two reasons. Firstly, to help the Christians to live in today's society. If we don't know how to understand postmodern society, how can we live as Christians in postmodern society? But also to build bridges to other people, not just to say, this is what we believe, but to say it in a way in which they will say, yeah, that actually makes sense. It's not what I thought the media was saying to me. So in one sense, the big question is how we can be plausible today. A lot of apologetics is on credibility. Can we believe it? But plausible means that people don't even think of it. But in today's terms, we are users of the Christian faith. And I know, for example, if ever my wife buys something on the internet or we go for an Airbnb, she looks to see what other users say. It's the first thing she does, the recommendations of other users. We are the users of the Christian faith. We are the recommenders in the scattered church with all the people that we meet. So that's very important.